Hello, my name is Debbie Nelson, and this is my presentation over the Air Force Supply Squadron case study. The Korean War was fought between North Korea and South Korea from June 25, 1950 through July the 27th of 1953. On June 27th of 1950, the United States entered into the Korean War after North Korea's refusal to withdraw their troops. Within 2 months of fighting, the South Korean Army and the American forces were at the point of defeat. After a devastating defeat at the Battle of Osan, the United States and the South Korean troops were pushed back, and the realization set in that they would need more troops and more supplies in order to maintain their position. Colonel Pete Novak was assigned to take over command and coordinate the squadron, which was responsible for the airlifting of supplies into combat zones. When he arrived, he found only disorganization, arguing, and unmanageable workloads. Colonel Novak knew it was imperative to rectify the chaotic situation within the squadron if the United States was to be of any benefit to winning this war. He began by introducing himself as the squadron's new commander and clearly establishing their mission. He also emphasized the importance of their jobs and what their efforts would mean to the men fighting on the front lines. Every person in the squadron was important, and each one had a vital function within this group. His next steps were to reach out to each of the demographics within the squadron. First, he looked to the officers and those in charge of particular departments and discussed their goals and the implementation of what was needed to make the squadron successful. Next, he visited with the enlisted men and listened to their input, their disagreements, as well as their complaints. He went on missions in order to get a first-hand perspective on supply deliveries and even helped with the unloading of supplies on the front lines. It was because of his thorough efforts that he was able to identify key issues which were the cause of breakdowns within the company. Colonel Novak was able to quickly identify key issues which were the cause of the breakdown of effectiveness within the company. Arguments and disagreements among the leaders of the unit caused disorganization and chaos. Duplication of orders was a frequent cause of confusion. The enlisted men suffered from poor living conditions and the lack of motivation for their jobs. Their complaints fell to deaf ears or to individuals who couldn't institute the change needed for improvement. And finally, individuals were not being utilized to their fullest potential. As Colonel Novak interacted with all of these men, he learned every single person's name, and he learned background information regarding each one of them. He learned their strengths, he learned their skills, and their capabilities. The duties of the men were reassigned in order to best utilize their abilities. He continued to hold staff meetings so he could work with officers in order to resolve disagreements. A proper change of command and authority was clearly established in order to reduce confusion, duplication of orders, and to hold individuals responsible for their actions. Within 2 months, Colonel Novak was able to institute change that was not only apparently obvious, but it was successful. Communication was clear, and the expectations of the men within the unit were now clearly defined. The squadron was now well organized, and the men could take pride in their work. The overall morale of the company improved due to the positive movement toward their company goal. They were no longer a liability to the war effort. They quickly became one of the most efficient supply squadrons in the Korean War. There is no doubt that Colonel Novak was a strong leader. He proved this in how he took an already established unit and completely changed its method of operation with astounding success. He knew that he must follow a very specific order of action if his efforts were to be effective. His first step was to define a course of action that would solve the underlying issue. This process included gathering information regarding the problem to be rectified. He knew that the unit had not been accomplishing the needed goals, but the reasoning behind the failure had not been yet defined. He acquired as much information as possible and then set to differentiating between the facts and the opinions. Communication and goals were two issues which he felt needed to be clearly defined before progress could be made within the collective group. Communication was an immediate red flag that he had to address in order to establish order from chaos. He began at the top with the officers and the non-commissioned officers in order to define the proper chain of command and communication. He also visited with the enlisted men and reminded them of how vital their jobs and efforts were to winning the war. He instilled a level of morale back into the squadron and clearly established the goal of their mission to everyone. He did not immediately utilize his position to institute change. He first established a rapport with the men of his unit. Colonel Novak saw the need to reorganize the duties of some of the members within the squadron. After learning their strengths, he was able to reassign enlisted men into areas where their skills best suited the team's efforts. He also used his position to reestablish a proper chain of command among the officers. Motivation and inspiration were a very obvious necessity among the men. Knowing their efforts had not been effective in helping the men who were fighting on the front lines, the men of the supply unit began to become discouraged. Colonel Novak reaffirmed their necessity and how vital their talents and skills were to the men on the front lines. He reminded them of the lives they could save with their continued efforts and dedication. He was able to do this in a few different ways. He not only learned about each man's personal skills and abilities in order to assign them to more appropriate jobs, but he also put himself in their shoes. Colonel Novak flew on missions to experience the job firsthand. He joined the men on the front lines to deliver supplies and even contributed with the manual labor. Colonel Novak inspired the men by leading by example. Conflict management was a necessity in order to resolve disagreements which were ongoing within the command staff. As change was being established within the company, Colonel Novak continued having staff meetings in order to open up lines of communication between the disagreeing parties. He assigned key responsibilities only when everyone was in attendance of these meetings so that there would be no misunderstanding as to who was to oversee which duties. Colonel Novak came into a situation which was disorganized and increasingly chaotic. Decisions needed to be made in order to reestablish a sense of order. Indecision would have only led to more of the same behaviors which were causing the squadron to be ineffective in their duties. He left no doubt among his subordinates that he had a plan and that he was to be obeyed in these orders. If he had come in appearing indecisive, the team may not have been so keen to follow him. Colonel Novak was very successful in building the squadron into a team. A team begins with a leader. He, as their leader, showed personal interest in them, not just what they could do for the team. He visited with them both on duty and off duty so that he could connect with the men as a person and not just as a commander. This is how he was able to learn of their skills and their abilities. In doing this, he was potentially able to give the men a job which was more aligned with their passions and their knowledge base. He achieved large-scale change with the trust and respect of his subordinates. Not only was he able to establish the change, but it was undoubtedly successful and effective in achieving the squadron's mission. The narrative of Colonel Novak has a lot to say regarding leadership, its necessity, and how to implement it effectively. He was introduced into a scenario which had no established leadership and was essentially failing at its mission. This squadron was essential to the success of the South Korean and American forces on the ground in the Korean War. If they failed, the troops would fail as well. He knew that for this squadron to be effective, order must be established, problems must be identified, and the purpose must be reinstated to the men within the unit. His authority was immediately established by the chain of command which sent him there, assessed the needs of the unit, demonstrated his ability to lead despite being a newcomer to the group, and established change with the least amount of resistance. In conclusion, Colonel Pete Novak was able to effectively step in and transform his squadron from disarray into an indispensable unit during the Korean War. He took a military squadron whose designated purpose was not achieved or effective and completely reimagined it from the ground up. The re-engineering of the unit was only successful because of his management skills and his leadership by example. Thank you very much for your attention.